The director D.W. Griffith released his epic Birth of a Nation to receptive crowds in 1915. It is regarded as a path-breaking use of cinematography. It is the story of one South Carolina's family struggled during the Civil War and Reconstruction. This family, the protagonists, are white. The antagonists first are the Union Army, then the radical Reconstructionists, then the black Republicans in power. The scene we will examine is, I quote, an historical facsimile of South Carolina's legislature in 1871. This scene is not an historical facsimile. It is the worst kind of racist caricature. Maybe this shouldn't be surprising. The movie, after all, like all historical interpretations, was a product of its time. This was World War I America. The country had a Southern-born Democrat ensconced as president.
Down south, when you do anything that's wrong. Down south, when you do anything that's wrong.
This was the era of Jim Crow legislation in the South. This is when water fountains and restrooms and parks and telephone booths, schools and movie theaters and swimming pools and the Army became segregated legally. This is when the right to vote for all intent and purposes was abrogated for African Americans in the South. It's when the 14th Amendment no longer retained its original meaning.
Put you under man to call Captain Jack. He'll sure write a name up and down your back.
So to have a movie that so completely champions racial subordination is not surprising.
Put you down in a ditch with a great long spade. Put you down in a ditch with a great long spade. You wish to God that you hadn't never been made.
There were black members of the legislature, and like the movie portrays, they did represent a majority of the total legislature in the decade after 1867. Their numbers were greatest in the House. In the Senate, only in the 1868 session did they have a majority. Like many of their white colleagues, the black legislators were representatives of constituents who were extremely poor and who had little, if any, schooling. It is understandable, therefore, that many blacks in the South Carolina legislature, again, like their white colleagues, were illiterate. But this did not make them uncouth or ill-fitted to legislate. In this respect, the movie had it wrong. In 1924, the Journal of Negro History published Aruthius Taylor's book-length manuscript on Reconstruction in South Carolina. Among his many topics were the black legislators and the accomplishments of the Republican-dominated legislature during Reconstruction. He spends considerable time quoting from newspapers that supported the Democrats and takes primary source evidence from the pens of the white reporters who praised black Republican legislators as worthy political foes, even as they disagreed completely with Republican policies. The Daily News referred to W.J. Whipper as an intelligent man and very popular in the party. The Chesterfield Democrat praised Henry Shrewsbury as a politician who was intelligent and understands the true interests of all classes. The Courier reported that Representative Jameson, an irascible little man, was possessed, however, of sound practical sense, and it described Representative Bozeman as an intelligent, educated man. The News and Courier described Samuel Lee as one who was well educated and speaks fearlessly and forcefully. Representative Bamfield, the same paper found, was a very young man of very calm nerves and an evenly balanced mind. These descriptions don't quite conjure the fried chicken-wielding man from Griffith's film. Nor does the examination of black legislators produced by James S. Pike. Pike was a New York Tribune reporter who, in 1874, published The Prostrate State, a look at South Carolina's fiscal problems. Take the chairman of the House Committee of Ways and Means. He is another full black man. By his position, he has charge of the most important business of the House. He was elected for his solid qualities, and he seems always to conduct himself with discretion. Two of the best speakers in the House are quite black. Go into the Senate. It's not too much to say that the leading man of the Republican Party in that body is Beverly Nash, a man wholly black. He has apparently consulted more and appealed to more in the business of the body than any man in it. It is admitted by his white opposition colleagues that he has more native ability than half the white men in the Senate. Likewise, according to Dr. Taylor, the Republicans in South Carolina passed a great deal of legislation. And it was not legislation that granted sexual access to white women or made whites the subordinate race. These accomplishments can't go solely to African American politicians, for they did have the support of white Republicans. These are missing from the movie, but in actuality the support of scalawags, that is white Southerners, and carpetbaggers, white Northerners, was indispensable in passing the legislation. It makes the legislation biracial, even though it was not bipartisan. As Taylor lists, the South Carolina legislature passed laws to enforce the Civil Rights Bill and the 14th Amendment. It passed several bills establishing and rationalizing a free public education system. This was the first public school system in South Carolina. They reorganized the state university and allowed black students to apply and participate. They also set up a scholarship system to send 3 African American students to college per year. They passed a homestead law and a land commission to regulate it. They set up a Bureau of Agricultural Statistics to encourage capital investment in farming, and passed a bill to aid the cotton and woolen manufacturers of the state. Finally, and most controversially, they passed bills allocating direct funding for several railway ventures. As the historian John Reynolds pointed out in his 1905 book Reconstruction in South Carolina, at least 2 of these railroad investitures lost considerable funds for the state. In fact, as Reynolds details, There's evidence that some Republican legislators pocketed sums of money allocated to the failing railroads. This is indeed the main thesis of Reynolds' work. African American Republican legislators were crooks. They devised legislative schemes that put money in their own pockets. While some might have been crooks, and remember that the 1870s were a time characterized by corruption at all branches of government, from both parties and both races, Reynolds presents no evidence they were incapable as politicians. Rather, they were uber politicians, passing a remarkable amount of legislation, buried within which were provisions that enabled a few to gain personal profits. Griffith misses all these details about the actual legislative history during Reconstruction in South Carolina, but don't dismiss his interpretation too quickly. He may have been off base about the history he portrayed, but his understanding of the historiography of Reconstruction was right on. History became a professional discipline at the turn of the 20th century, and it earned respectability as a profession with its monographs on Reconstruction. James Ford Rhodes, who wrote a multi-volume history of the United States, called Reconstruction repressive, uncivilized, and a scheme that pandered to the ignorant Negroes. William Dunning, a Columbia professor, wrote that in the South, all the forces that made for civilization were dominated by a mass of barbarous freedmen. John Burgess, colleague of Dunning's at Columbia, was frank in his anti-black sentiments. The claim that there is nothing in the color of the skin from the point of view of political ethics is a great sophism. A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason. Has never, therefore, created any civilization of any kind. To put such a race of men in possession of a state government in a system of federal government is to trust them with the development of political and legal civilization upon the most important subjects of human life, and to do this in communities with a large white population is simply to establish barbarism in power over civilization. Even Woodrow Wilson, writing his History of the American People, noted African Americans' inability to attain citizenship. Wilson wrote, "Adventurers swarmed out of the North as much the enemies of the one race as of the other, to cozen, beguile, and use the Negroes. In the villages, the Negroes were the office holders, men who knew none of the uses of authority except its insolence. The policy of the congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South, in their determination to put the white South under the heel of the black South." He would go on to write about the end of Reconstruction. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. The first generation of historians agreed with Griffith that African Americans were incapable of being political leaders. This was the consensus, one that would take decades to undo. It is no wonder that President Wilson, when he saw the film, said it was like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true.